complicated, you know, man. Like a dang Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about that blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messing up.
If you share my lack of faith in our health system, you should take control of your well-being. Building resilience and maintaining good health for the long term needs to be a priority. Axios Remote Fitness Coaching offers one-stop expert advice on training, diet, and lifestyle. You can purchase customized workout plans for strength training or structured exercise. If you're serious about maximizing your potential, you can book time with a coach or customize your routine and get video feedback on your performance. I know the owner, and he's one of us. Visit Axios and support those who support the show. Follow the link in the description to become a man of action with Axios. No one blames you for being weak, but it's your fault if you stay that way. All right, Luthmplaer, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing, man?
All right, how you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm excited to speak with you again. I know it's been a little while since we had you last on. I'm just going to go ahead and assume that everyone is familiar with your work. I've had you on the show a couple times. And I'll give you a chance to shill at the end. But we're here to cover quite a massive, like one of the longest Substacks I've ever read. But it's a good one, right?
Yeah.
So
I saw I've been told. Not the phrase won't work.
I thought it's good, right? And look, like I can bring whoever I want on this show. I decided to bring you back. So
yeah, I know. I want to thank ST in our community who did a lot of literary review and helping me organize my thoughts into structure. His name's like I forget what his name, but ST stands for something structural something. But like he's really good at structuring thoughts, and he's a philosopher. So I kind of collaborated with him to try and get that Substack's called Scribbles for a reason, because I just kind of write my thoughts down stream of consciousness. And I kind of looked at the about a week before I actually published it. I looked at it. It's like this is a mess. I need someone to go through this and help me organize it. And I know ST from like through like I think it was like Paul and Prude. He lurks in structural thoughts. Yeah, his name is literally structured thoughts, which is like exactly what I needed. And so like I kind of
thanks, Prude.
I asked him to like help me like put my thoughts, because he has a lot of thoughts on like paganism and Nietzscheanism too, and I like the way he structures them in a clear way. I hate philosophy. I'm usually anti-philosophical, but ST talks slow and smoothly enough and uses simple dumb words that my brain can understand. My Irish IQ can only go so far, and he really helps me understand it.
Well, it's interesting because I sort of feel similarly about theology, where, and this is not a pronouncement. This is a admission of a personal defect. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, same here.
To me, I lose patience with theology very quickly. It does, like I just lose patience with it. It seems very much like highly academic questions that most normal practitioners of the faith have absolutely nothing to do with, and again, like it's the maybe it's like the practical Anglo in me. I just look at it and I like throw my hands up.
I gotta be honest, when I was younger and went through like Catholic, when I was in Catholic, I grew up Catholic and was in Catholic school, and I tried to be Lutheran but can't really get vibing with it. But in Catholic school, when I was first introduced to the Apostolic Fathers and I'm only half Irish. The other half, what it is. But anyway, when they showed us like all the Apostolic Fathers, I just had this moment where I was a teenager. I was like, oh my God, my church was founded by autists. And
I truly like have a deep respect for Aquinas, but yeah. That man had the most raging case of autism I've ever seen.
When you're in Augustus and you see him like going for like 30 paragraphs on these like peach trees that he stole as a kid, it's like, dude, get over it. Like God forgives you.
Augustine's better. Augustine is like, that's like kind of like, he kind of draws you along. Meanwhile, the Thomist tradition is like, what if I answered every question? Like really, every single question in exhaustive detail with references, which like, don't get me wrong, that's better than anything I've done. Like it's an incredible labor, but at the same time, I'm like, no, that's a whole lot of work. But anyway, so we're not just here to shit talk Catholics. We're actually here to shit talk pagans.
No, not exactly, but gently encourage them that pagans like to go back to tradition, but they have to go further back. Don't stop.
So fair enough then. Do you want to introduce the Substack you wrote? And I have it linked in the description, and I highly recommend it. It's a very good one. It's probably the most compelling thing I've read on Substack in 2023. So
Yay.
full endorse from me. But it's called The Judeo-Christian Myth is the title that you've given it. So do you want to just kind of like very briefly, introduce the question you were trying to answer?
Yeah, like again, I grew up Catholic and spent about a decade experimenting with Protestantism, and this word Judeo-Christian has shown up throughout my youth, and it never really sat right with me. Like I'm from a mixed, like my great grandmother was from a Jewish line and converted to Eastern Catholicism, and the two cultures have always like been strange bedfellows growing up. So I know intimately that this is bullshit. Forgive my language. I know growing up it doesn't you can't square that circle or you can't circle that square. I don't know, but this Judeo-Christian terminology really like has always annoyed me. It doesn't sit well with me because I have elders in my family from both sides that it's clearly not like it's not the jigsaw doesn't come from the same set. I for most of my childhood I did not have the appropriate way of understanding it or explaining it. About probably now close to 15, no, close to like 13 years ago, there was this guy on YouTube. His name's Alan Horvath. He does a lot. He was like kind of, I guess you could categorize him as sort of Messianic Jew, not really, actually from a Syriac. But he grew up. He's a half Syrian. He's dead now, but he was a half Syrian that grew up in Tennessee and had like the Protestant upbringing, and his ancestors came from Syria, could speak Aramaic, didn't need a translator, could read the Bible in Jesus's original like hometown tongue. So this is like he didn't even speak Hebrew, he spoke Aramaic, which is a very similar language, but he knew his stuff. And he would point out, because again he's from an Aramaic Syrian background, not quite an Israeli background, that even in the Old Testament there was just this like divide. You can see it in the Old Testament. I call it the divide between the prophets and the priests. This has caused some people to be annoyed when I use this term. I've had a lot of pushback term using it. But you always have, and even in scholarship, you sometimes see like this divide between the terms that they use as the cult of Yahweh and the Elohimists. Like I see that terminology in academic circles a lot, and so you always have this like divide between the religious people in the temple in Jerusalem, this like urban cult, and then the desert prophets that they're sort of part of the same religious tradition, but they just don't get along. And Alan Horvath had this. His view was that like the Judaic half of this relationship, let's call it, has always been butting heads with the prophetic Aramaic urbanite ruralites. Even in Jesus' day, Jesus spoke Aramaic primarily. He was from Galilee. He was a country bumpkin. Meanwhile, the guys in Jerusalem, they're speaking Hebrew and Greek. They have different traditions. Even their like quote unquote, I don't want to use the term political party, but the political parties, like there's Pharisees and Sadducees in the temple in Jerusalem, and then out in the desert there's the Essenes and the Zealots, and they're just not getting along. And so there's this thread in the history of the Middle East, not just in Judaism, but also in the neighboring religions. People forget that there is still a semi-Semitic religion among the Samaritans to this day that speaks Aramaic and writes in Aramaic and is not Jewish. And then you have like kind of like the desert traditions that eventually became Islam, and then you have the Christian traditions that kind of grew up in like Damascus, Anatolia, Alexandria, like the offshoots of where Judaism was. And then you have the cult in Jerusalem that just really doesn't get along. Anyway, that's a quick brief introduction, like I guess surveying the landscape.
So let's go through this, and like I've said before, this is quite a long essay, but it's long for a reason. So if it's all right with you, I'm probably going to go through this by topic.
Yeah.
And so you're speaking about this idea of Judeo-Christian. So I'll say you and I have a very fairly different background, right? We're both East Coast guys, but there's a pretty we're very different culturally. I'm from the Bible Belt, and so my exposure to this is essentially through like Zionist evangelical baby boomers, who on one hand I love these people, they're my people, but on the other hand, I also as a kid didn't like that sentence just didn't make sense to me. Judeo-Christian values. Like we need America to get back to its Judeo-Christian values. And it was sort of this weird elision, that both meant like hometown, family values, but also the state of Israel. And I'm not necessarily, we shouldn't necessarily get into that, right? Like that's probably a separate discussion.
Too spicy for you too.
Yeah, of course. I don't know who the new guy's name is. I think it's Niall or something, but I probably don't like him either. But nonetheless, right? And so seeing that as kind of a political project from people like, Dennis Prager and Dinesh D'Souza, those types, like the National Review types, it also just didn't sit well with me. And so you're specifically, if I can, put words in your mouth, addressing a criticism from pagan circles, which is basically the idea that like Christianity is nothing more than essentially repackaged Judaism. And so your first section is essentially, defining, that phrase, explaining the etymology of, Judeo-Christian. And then also going through essentially like what makes something Jewish, so to speak. And I realize this is a delicate topic. I'll respect it as best I can. But do you want to go into that kind of introduction to your piece?
Yeah, and again, we're a few weeks out from when I wrote it, so I'm starting to forget what I myself wrote. So feel free to guide me, structure my thoughts a bit. I'm a bit erratic, but I did do a pretty broad like scan through different variations of the term Judeo-Christian. Even how I spelled it in the title is kind of like an old-fashioned way of spelling it because I just kind of wanted to like look like it was old-fashioned. And as far as I could tell, like up until the 1800s, the term generally was used either to make fun of Christians trying to be Jewish, or make fun of or not make fun, or like describe Jewish people that are coming to Christ, kind of before we had the term Messianic Judaism.
Which, in a weird way, that recognizes a distinction between the two. The fact that the term was used for that.
Yeah, in those days, the hyphen was more a where you're coming from and where you're going rather than a stationary position, which is important. This is important to recognize. Like, it's describing a movement, whereas today it describes a position. And that change from a movement from one to the other to this is now a stationary thing. There's a history behind that. I actually didn't go into it very much in the article itself. This is probably for a part 2, but there was a significant push in the 1800s to invent this Judeo-Christian identity from move it from describing going from one religion to the other to a position that you now have to hold. The classic progressive trick: give the conservative something that isn't conservative, and then suddenly they start defending it, right? But I personally found that like some of the earliest uses was from Nietzsche, so I kind of think Nietzsche might have significantly done the task of redefining that term to mean a position rather than emotion. There are some vague mentions of it. I mentioned in my article like I found a few mentions of it in the earlier 1800s, but before the 1800s it doesn't really seem to show up that much. I might have missed something. Feel free to tell me if I did. We all know about the Inquisition and the long history of combativeness between Christians and Jews. It's nothing to ignore. And yet suddenly, and then magically in the 1800s, there's this weird kind of like, we're one thing now. Where'd that happen? Where'd that come from? How'd that happen?
So, and that's an interesting point in its own. But one of the things that you address is the ways you could prove that Christianity is Jewish. So your first one, you address the different ways in which something could be considered Jewish, right? You ran a Twitter poll, and apparently the most common response was by blood.
Yeah.
So I think that's a quick one to dismiss. But why do you think that does not apply to Christianity?
Because pagans don't typically stay within the bounds of blood. I made the comparison that's a Mott and Bailey argument. Like the issue of blood is brought up, and then quickly they don't want you to think about it too long, because obviously like a bunch of Germans in the Teutonic Forest that are Christian are no longer Jewish by blood. They've lost. There's no Jews in the forest, unless they're. I don't want to make the joke, but So this claim that Christianity has a Jewish blood origin, it's like a ship of Theseus. Well, like eventually, when you get far away from the Middle East or the major cities, you don't have any more Jewish people by blood. So there's no like a Jewish person with the Jewish blood like manipulating the religion out in the middle of the backwoods of nowhere. And it just seemed to be like a bit of a Mountain Bailey argument where they'll instead go to, well, now instead of blood, we're going to talk about what the blood has made. Like the argument, well, it was made by a Jew, so it must therefore be Jewish. And okay, then you've gone away from the issue of blood. You've changed the argument now. Once the Christian has to be forced into the argument of blood, then they immediately change the debate to more of a mimetic origin rather than a genetic origin.
Well, and that brings up you bring the specific example of the editor of Mein Kampf, right?
Yeah. So thank you for structuring my thoughts. So if we go off of the pagan argument of why Christianity is Jewish, you actually have to give up a lot more than just Christianity. Like Hitler hired a Jew to edit Mein Kampf. There were two editors. Both of them, by the way, were kind of insane. Rudolf Hess was the other editor. He ran away in the middle of the war to Great Britain for some reason.
Odd Jay Burden bit of lore. I actually have driven in his personal Mercedes, but that's a story for another time.
I think it's Robert Hess, but Robert Hess is this like loony bin who I think it was 1943 or something. He had this like vision that if he flew to England and brokered a peace, he could save Germany. Like he literally went insane. The British arrested him. It was like, what the hell are you doing, dude? And the other editor for Mein Kampf was what's his name? I wrote the name down. Dang it. What did I say in the article? I forget. Yeah, Emil Morris. I mean, you can tell from the name Emil Morris, it's very Judaic sounding. But Emil Morris was the grandson of one of the major like Jewish theater operations in the Thalia Theater in Hamburg. And this is kind of funny story. The fact that like there were people in the Nazi Party that were like, Hitler, why do you have a Jew editing Mein Kampf? This is kind of weird.
Just a note of correction because the chat is in uproar. It's Rudolf Hess, not Robert Hess.
Oh, my bad. Sorry, these German.
But anyway,
cover up. I'd love to hear Charlie's thoughts on it later on. So like, anyway. Half of Mein Kampf is edited by a Jewish person, and then when the Nazis like, why are you hiring a Jew to write an anti-Semitic book? And it was like, he's an honorary Aryan for me. So okay, so the pagan will have to throw out Mein Kampf. So there goes the mid-century Germans. You go further back. I give a couple of examples of like different times when there's this odd pattern in like early modern, late medieval history where Christians will hire a Jewish convert to write their anti-Semitic or edit their anti-Semitic literature. It's kind of hilarious. I find this kind of funny. Like Luther was inspired to write his spicy book on the certain people and their lies. He hired a Jewish convert to be his editors. It's the rumored. He at the very least it's known he read the book. He said he was inspired by the book, and then a few months later he wrote his book. So it's very clearly from his letters that he was inspired and might have consulted with the guy. And it seems like that they it was known that they wrote to each other, gave gifts to each other. He was probably an editor that wrote, edited a couple things. So now you have to throw out pretty much all your favorite anti-Semitic literature for the last 1,000 years.
Well, and then you make an argument, another side of that argument, which is that you actually examine the scriptures. So specifically, you use this figure of Uriah the Hittite.
Yeah.
So can you explain, who Uriah is, in the Bible, and also why him being a Hittite is significant?
Yeah, Hittites are not Semitic. In the biblical tradition, the Hittite empire was a Hamite empire. This is a bunch of tribes. You don't have to worry. The point is, they're not Jewish people. But the Hittite Empire was also a confederation that would absorb neighboring tribes. And as any lovely pie migration fanboy will tell you, Anatolia was inhabited by a number of Indo-European tribes, as well as the Caucasus Mountains, Anatolia, Iran, famously named after Aryans. These were Indo-European peoples that the Hittites integrated into their empire as confederate tribes. One amongst which is the Luwian people, I think they're called. I can't pronounce the name correctly. And the Luwians would inherit the name Hittite and migrate south after the Hittite Empire fell. And so these are Indo-European people that are having a name called Hittite. They also call themselves Luwians, and they're basically white people. They're white people in the Middle East. And you have Uriah the Hittite, who is one of King David's special forces, let's say. He's one of the elite guard. Marries into the Jewish noble families, has a David famously kills him and takes his wife because she's hot. And well, oopsie, but many such cases. But Uriah is a famous biblical character. He's married into Israel. And as you know from a number of other parts of the Bible, if you read down the list of his special forces, it names several tribes that are not Jewish. So these are Confederate tribes, some from the Hittite Empire, some from Sinai, some from the Middle East. These are different groups of people from different family lineages. Some of them are white, some of them are African. Israel is more. It's important to remember the Jewish people are one tribe of 12. 11 of which were destroyed. And then in addition to those 12 tribes, there were several neighboring Canaanite, Hittite, Indo-European, African, different tribe groups that were integrated into Israel. So Israel is like, you have the line of Judah for the monarchy, the 11 tribes for priests and nobles. You have the dozen or so other people integrated in from other people. So even if we go by blood, Israel itself is not entirely only Jewish. It actually mixes in with the natives quite a bit. And so we can't really say for sure that Israel is itself entirely Jewish by blood, because it's, God's constantly telling them, stop doing misogyny, and they don't want to stop.
Well, one of the interesting things that's brought up by this is that, the Hittites, in the way that they, describe themselves, as essentially like white guys with red hair and blue eyes, which is
the Hittite, not Hittites, the Luwians.
Yes, because you included some some descriptions that they wrote of themselves. Portraits, or not portraits, sculptures they've made of themselves, and they're very conspicuous for featuring blue eyes.
Yeah. Blue eyes, blonde hair, typical Aryan folk, and this is how they're depicting themselves. And then later on, Uriah the Hittite is one of the constituent members of that tribe that moves south and integrates into Israel's empire. So Uriah and his family, living in Israel, they're bringing their genes in. Northern Israel is basically becoming white. Southern Israel is becoming dark. And this is what's happening. Israel is doing its, these are ancient tricks. they're mixing into the local natives. And God tells them not to, but they're like, I don't care. And, there is admittedly this interesting bit, because pagans will then bring up, whoa, hold a second. The Bible says that these people were slaughtered. The Canaanites should be killed off and genocide. True, but the Israelites didn't go through with it. They ended up just marrying into the natives. And you can yell at God for genociding people, fine, but the fact of the matter is they survived. They lived, and then they merged into Israel. So again, not to kick sand into the argument, but if we're going to go off of what's Jewish, maybe we can say Judah, the one tribe of many, is Jewish. Just Judah, okay, like one tribe of Israel is Jewish, and then Christianity doesn't really come from that tribe anyway. A lot of the converts to a lot of the founders of Christianity are from other tribes. Some of them are zealots from the Arabian desert that wouldn't even really be Jewish anyway. They'd be like Jewish practitioner, but their bloodlines would be Middle Eastern, sometimes white. And of course, when Christianity does finally start, the biggest conversions are Anatolia and Syria, so and Egypt. And so the biggest converts to Christianity rather are not even Jewish. It was founded by a Jewish person who himself had mixed blood from other groups, who himself had his friends from other groups, who themselves went to other non-Jewish people to convert. So where exactly what's left of the Jewish blood here at this point? Like within a generation, you have basically all Greeks and Romans.
Yeah, that's interesting. And
sorry for ranting. Keep
no, not at all.
Interrupt whenever I go off on a tangent.
See, I'm kind of torn between, on one hand, it's like I want to pursue every rabbit hole because it's all fascinating, but on the other one, it's like I'm looking at this article and we're not even close to a little bit through it, because again, like this is a very interesting article. Prude, I see, is in chat, and we're both, he and I have, encouraged you to turn this into a book because it's quite interesting. And there's enough material that you could really like, you could,
Yeah.
would be a good chunk of the way there.
I
So
don't know.
one of the digressions that you take at this point when you're talking about the Hittites is essentially examining Hittite religion.
Oh yeah.
And so you use this to essentially attack the claim that what's considered like the Norse paganism is kind of like unique to that area of the world.
Yeah. And I mean, even if you are a big fan of a lot of pagans I know are fan of pie migration, which itself isn't unbiblical. It kind of follows the post-Noah migration maps that are theorized by medieval people without knowing about pie migration. Just happens to match up. But there is this idea that Nordic, especially amongst Norse people, Nordic religious people, that this is the definitive like religion of their people. This claim does not really hold up if you analyze it. The Bronze Age collapse is pretty much where this religion shows up in the northern people. Before the Bronze Age collapse, they don't really have icons or imageries or arts that reflect what we would identify as Norse paganism. It's much more focused on deer and songbirds, and this is this is like a really, really old Indo-European religion, which you'll find amongst the Celts and the native Iberians. This is probably an Ice Age 10,000-year-old religious cult around spring. And so, obviously, if you're a people group coming from the Ice Age, spring becomes a bit of a religious ceremony, because when you've made it through another year of life. And so these people worship the signs of spring, the songbird, the deer, the things that show up when spring shows up. Around the Bronze Age collapse, the climate shifts and Scandinavia freezes over for a couple of centuries. And at this point, the imagery of deers and songbirds disappears from the archaeological record, and you have a shift in religion because these things aren't showing up anymore. These gods have failed them. The only relic of that era of religious iconography that appears to survive into Norse mythology is some of the outfits of the heirs. I think there's like two groups of gods in Norse theology. There's the Vanir, I forget, but like the more feminine natural deities of the in many pagan religions, you have the old gods, the older gods, and then the old gods. And many of the older gods, these like nature imageries, including even Loki, in some ways the way Loki's depicted appears to mirror this older nature cult, spring cult. But then after the Bronze Age collapse happens, the weather changes. There's an ecological disaster. Basically, the Scandinavian region freezes over, and you start seeing a shift in what's being worshipped to that of fire and thunder and steel and things we would associate with Thor and Odin. And that's like the new religious practices of North. And so we're talking about maybe something between 1500 BC to 500 BC, something in that range, that those 1,000 years.
And just to clarify, right, your claim is not that this is, because I see Vingel, who is Norwegian in chat. Your claim is not that this is that animalistic art is the only art being produced, but that was the locus of religion, correct?
Yeah, in specifically in the Norse region, the Scandinavian region, Denmark through Sweden and Norway, the primary artifacts that show up are deer imagery, like a horn, deer horn helmets, and deer and songbird, waterbird, songbird kind of iconography. And this is mostly in the form of like art on metal, bronze and stuff like that, which at this point, let's transfer to what I'm saying. The bronze in this region is not from Scandinavia. So I linked to several research articles. The bronze in the Scandinavian region comes from Cyprus, about half a day sail from the Lowian people. Now, we haven't talked about it yet, but the Lowian people, the Hittite sub-tribes, the Indo-European people of the Hittite Empire, they had a god named Tarhuns. And Tarhuns, spelt very similar to Thor, was a god of thunder. Tarhuns imagery is a hammer and a kind of like a lightning rod as a symbol of thunder and hammer. It's basically a prototype of Thor. Tarhuns is the son of a wisdom god. who is sometimes identified as having one eye, or at least a focus on his seeing eye, like one of his eyes. It's not necessarily true that he's blind in one eye like Odin, but there are a number of parallels to Odin. I forget the native name of the Luwians for this god, but he's basically the equivalent of Enki among the Sumerians and Babylonians. At the time, he's not called Enki; he's called E or Ye, similar to Yahweh, which is kind of interesting. We'll talk about that another time, maybe. Tarhuns is the iconography of a lot of warriors of the Luwians. I in my article, I post to some of their artifacts. The artifacts of Tarhuns include a number of hammer pendants, like you see with Viking warriors. This is this is like 2,000 years before Vikings, but you see the familiar hammer iconography in the form of a chain, a necklace of a hammer. Not exactly the same. They are in the shape of a hammer, but they're used more as family seals to press into wax. They are in the shape of hammer. They look like Thor hammer necklaces that you see pagans wear, but they're more so used for family insignia, for stamping contracts. Contracts existed back then. you would essentially like sign your family to a contract of war, much like the Vikings. Like famously, the Normans were contract warriors for the French to fight other Northmen. But my claim is that at the point of the Bronze Age collapse, the Hittite Empire collapses. Some of the Luwian people move south into Israel to find fertile lands and people to serve that still have money. But around the same time that collapse occurs, you start seeing familiar Norse iconography up north, where again, the Scandinavians are already importing bronze from Cyprus, right next to the god Tarhuns and his iconography.
So your point is essentially that there was contact between these different people groups.
There was contact between the Northmen through the rivers of Europe down to Cyprus. They were importing bronze. They were importing material goods. When the Bronze Age collapse occurs, the bronze turns off, and the Norse switch to iron and steel. They try to do bronze, but like they eventually go to steel and iron. Some of the bronze continues for a little while, but essentially there appears to be a famously, religion often travels along trade routes. It appears that once the Norwegians abandon their old spring gods, they move to the gods of it seems like it's the gods of the Luwians. And so when anyway, to return to the point, I'm getting off topic, sorry. Pagans often say Christianity isn't native to Europe. It's a Middle Eastern religion. It's foreign. So is Norse. So is the Norse religion. I'm sorry to say it seems to be imported from Anatolia. Granted, the Anatolians practicing it were Indo-Europeans too. They would look just the same as the Norwegians. They were blonde hair, blue-eyed people. They lived in the hills of Anatolia and in the Caucasus Mountains. So they were cousin people. They were kin, if you will, distant kin to the Northmen. But essentially the religion does come from the Middle East. There's no doubt, in my mind at least.
Well, great. I think that's a good summation of your work. And if you're interested in this, I should clarify, there's a lot more in your article. There's more details. There's photos of these things. You can kind of judge for yourself. And I'm moving on, not because I'm uninterested, but because we have ground to cover, right?
We have 20 minutes left.
So the next place, you basically describe what is the next most common answer for what it means to be Jewish. And that is related to the Torah.
Yeah.
So the first thing you bring up is that it's kind of difficult to nail down what the Torah actually is. There's an obvious joke there, which I won't make. But essentially the problem is that the Torah can either mean the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, the entirety of Scripture, Jewish law in general. It's kind of difficult to nail that down, so to speak. But
and
you use a working definition of Mosaic law for the essay, correct?
Yeah. Because it comes from an oral background, not all the rabbi agreed with what even was Torah. But I'm going to use Mosaic law because this is a definitive cultural iconography of the Jews. They're Mosaic follower. They follow the Mosaic law. That's just what Judaism is.
Well, great. And so you specifically use that as a kind of an example of, Christianity not being Jewish. So do you want to go into how, we are not subject to Mosaic law and how we kind of have our own dispensation of commandments, so to speak?
Well, I don't like dispensationism, but
Yeah, sorry, that was just the word that came to mind. Again, as I will say many times, that's another stream for another day.
Yeah. So pagans will say, well, you're basically giving up the Torah, and God and Jesus said, I'm not overthrowing the Torah, right? Like, so therefore, why aren't you following the Torah? Because Torah was meant for Jews and not for Gentiles. Even before Christianity, there was an understanding that the Gentiles were not bound to Torah, as defined by the Mosaic Law. Let's be more specific. The Gentiles weren't bound to the Mosaic Law. The Mosaic Law was for the Jews. And so in the same way that pagans would be like, well, this is a religion for our people. Yeah, Judaism is not a religion for you. It's a religion for the Jewish people. You're not Jewish. Don't follow it.
Well, and this is another conversation that I actually find there are a few things that like genuinely like truly morally offend me. One of them is there's a bizarre trend of essentially like brain dead evangelicals converting to Messianic Judaism, including my barber, who is a very nice man, but I just bite my tongue because you should always be nice to a man who has a straight razor, right next to your throat. But nonetheless, every time, like it's interesting because these are thoughts that I have had myself. But specifically, my personal anecdote aside, you speak about the commandments of Noah and how that was generally considered to be the law for non-Jews. So do you want to go through, the commandments of Noah?
Yeah, so in Jewish tradition, and again, Judaism is just one Semitic religion from the region. Pretty much anybody who wasn't a Jew was expected to submit to the Noahic law. And if you were a Gentile that wanted to join the Abrahamic religion in ancient times, the rabbi would tell you, you don't have to follow the Mosaic law. You can just follow Noah's law. And Noah's law was essentially 7 laws that are considered like the Noahic covenant, if you will. If you obey these laws, God will bless you and save you. They are, first, don't worship idols. 2, don't curse God. 3, don't murder. 4, don't sleep around, adultery and sexual immorality. 5, don't steal. 6, don't eat the flesh of a torn living animal. So like, don't torture animals. Don't be mean. And 7,
so basically anything you see from the Chinese on Twitter.
Yeah. God doesn't like that. Oh, we'll say it. But and 7, establish courts of justice to enforce these laws. So this is basically the Noahic law. Basically says be civilized. That's really all it is. Don't be a barbarian. And these 7 laws were pretty much agreed by the rabbi. This is what the Gentiles should follow if they want to live in Israel. This is probably what Uriah the Hittite was following if he wasn't circumcised. This is probably what a lot of the constituent tribes of Israel followed if they weren't members of Abraham's seed, but they wanted to be part of the nation of Israel. They were bound by this covenant of God. In the tradition, and again, this is a broad tradition that stretches beyond just Israel. This is the same tradition as the Babylonians. They call him Naputishush, the lawgiver, the one who survived the flood in the Babylonian tradition, or the Sumerian tradition too. There's a number of names for this guy. We call him Noah. The Babylonians call him Naputishush. And if you think they're different religions, if you don't know, Babylonian is a Semitic language. It's a cousin of the Middle East. And there's a Sumerian and a number of other groups of people. These are all basically like family kin. You want to call Babylon Jewish? Feel free. You're kind of weird. I'm not going to care what you think. But so generally, Babylonians, Sumerians, Aramaic people, Egyptians to a lesser extent, Anatolians, they all kind of understood the law of either Noah, Naputishush, or later on Gilgamesh would inherit this law. This was considered the law of the Gentile, or the law of being civilized. This is what bound non-Jews to being civilized and salvation, basically. I'll stop there with just to kind of I might have lost my train of thought from babbling, but essentially, yeah.
No, so again, and you go into this in more length, and there's a discussion to be had about kind of covenantal theology. Which would make an interesting discussion, but we must press on.
Yeah. Well, just pause right there just to mention it, because that's kind of where I forgot to go off of. The point of this is God didn't only make a covenant with the Jewish people. As a matter of fact, the fact that he gave the Jewish people so much loss is probably suggesting that they were a bit wild. But the Noahic covenant is one that he gave to all mankind, And within that covenant in the Old Testament, there is a promise to European people, not to Jews. And again, this is why Christianity isn't a Jewish religion, because there are promises in the Old Testament, not for Jews. They're not meant for Jews. They're meant for Europeans. That's the famous covenant that God made with Japheth through the Noahic covenant. The Noahic covenant has within it, like, in addition to the laws, there are blessings and curses to different groups of people. To Japheth, he said, I will enlarge your territory. You might remember, right? Let me look where that is. Yeah. So, in Genesis, I think 9. Yeah, Genesis 9. It says, "Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind. Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers. Praise be to the Lord of God, the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem. May God extend Japheth's territory. May Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be the slave of Japheth." This has kind of been a Bible verse which has been practically erased in our era of French equality, libertarianism, liberty, and all that nonsense. This is God saying some groups of people have curses that are natural to them. Some groups of people have blessings that are natural to them. Likewise,
Well,
yep.
And it's interesting because this is a passage that was, and I cannot remember the man's name, but it was oftentimes cited by the South Africans when they were essentially like setting up their apartheid state, essentially as a justification for that. Obviously, I agree with all the things I'm supposed to agree with and disagree with all the things I'm supposed to disagree with, including obviously the state of South Africa. But nonetheless, right, like that, the idea that, that this kind of like radical French, egalitarianism, is in and of itself Christian is obviously not true.
Yeah.
But anyway, carry on. I just wanted to address that more explicitly.
Essentially, what this verse in this part of Genesis 9 says is that Japheth is considered the ancestor of Europeans. Shem is considered the ancestors of Middle Eastern people, and to less, and Ham is considered the ancestor of Africans and Asians. Basically, let's just be general there. There's exceptions to that rule. Migrations happen and all that jazz, but let's be general. What that means is Japheth, so long as he comes to the tents of Shem, will be given dominion over his brothers. That's an idiom that basically means, to come into someone's tent, it means to submit to their God, submit to their God, basically. So what that means is, so long as Europeans bow to the God of Shem, the God of Jesus, the Jews, and all that, they'll be given dominion over the world. If they don't, they will lose that dominion. So long as the Africans and Asians curse their fathers, they'll be made slaves. If they don't, they'll be free. They will not be made slaves so long as they obey their fathers.
And there's an interesting point to be made with Confucianism in an odd way, because that essentially is like kind of like institutionalized ancestor worship. Obviously not directly, but it is very like patrilineal.
And in many ways, African and Asian paganism echoes this promise of Noah. There's a heavy emphasis on the father being the lawgiver and the stability of the house, and once that's taken away, you get the chaos we see in the urban youth. And in China, you get like 10 million civilians killed by a dictator sometimes. I think that this claim, this is a claim that Genesis is making. The claim Genesis is making is, when Europeans are Christians, they rule the world. When they're not, they don't. When Africans and Asians obey their fathers, they are free. When they don't, they become slaves. And I would ask pagans, does history prove this? Is this proven by history? I would say, I want you to show me how it's not true.
Well, and aside from that, like just assuming that you have no respect for the scripture as any kind of like metaphysical document, right? Like just the text of it alone. It is very clear that differentiation between these groups of people is at the core of the document itself.
Yes.
That there are different deals essentially handed out to each group. That implies that those groups, one, exist, two, exist within God's ordered plan for the world. And that essentially that the Jews were viewed as distinct. And
Yeah.
since obviously like throughout the whole thing, and there's, much written by both Christians and Jews to this fact, neither of them saw each other as the same thing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the next part you go through is essentially, and I had never heard of this, but it's called the Midrash, which
The
is
Midrash. Yeah.
a collection of kind of like post New Testament rabbinical
Yeah,
writings.
yeah, and this is a good thing because, like, again, we want to define Jewish, and Torah leads into the Midrash. So, like, I think we've gone through Torah now enough. Christians are primarily not of the Torah; they're of Noah's covenant. The Midrash is a post. Rome comes in, nukes Jerusalem. Haha, you're out. God curses his people, basically. The Midrash is basically the collected writings of the rabbi in the couple of centuries after the destruction of the Second Temple. I'm not surprised most Gentiles don't know about it because it's kind of kept private to Judaism itself. Probably because if you study it, it kind of tells you Judaism is a lie. But yeah, the Midrash, which again, it's teaching material. It's not really. It's technically not doctrine. It's technically not what the religion should be based off of. But the way Judaism works, it's basically the actual religious text of the Jews. It's actually what they operate on. And the Midrash, of course, has a number of documents that try to explain what the hell happened. Why were they destroyed a second time, like with Babylon? Why did God allow the Romans to nuke Jerusalem, basically? There are a number of interesting texts here. For example, the rabbis teach that 40 years before the temple was destroyed, the signs of miracles and salvation stopped showing up in the temple. If you know your math, 40 years before the destruction of the temple was when Jesus was around, when he was preaching and crucified. So the Midrash accidentally admits that the Holy Spirit left the temple when Jesus died, or well, either when he died and raised again, or when he started his ministry, when he received his baptism. It's not clear. Who cares? It happened in that range of time. That's a big one. There's a few other examples I give, I think, but that's the big one in there is that the Midrash kind of confesses that Christianity is not Jew. I mean, it explicitly says Christianity is not Jewish, and it also accidentally, because again, it's written at a time before there was a proper distinction between the two religions. Well, no, not exactly. There was a distinction because some of this stuff comes from like 800 AD, so very clearly Christians and Jews have parted ways by then. But if the rabbi is saying, "Oh yeah, 40 years before the temple was destroyed, our miracles stopped showing up in the temple," what he's saying is Jesus was right. When Jesus cursed the temple, God literally left the temple.
So the last main point, and I think the last point we'll be able to address, because there's a little bit at the end about Nietzsche that I think there's enough there that we should maybe do a whole episode on it. But essentially is this idea of Judaism as one religion, which you kind of dispel, especially at least at the time of Christ.
Yeah. So again, at the time of Nietzsche, there was kind of sort of one religion called Judaism in Europe. There are other groups of Judaism, lesser known, in Spain and North Africa, but irrelevant. At the time of Jesus, Judaism was not really one religion. It was a religion in a state of schism. Again, there were the Pharisees who were and the Sadducees. The Pharisees were basically like what Judaism grows. Judaism as we know it today came primarily out of the Pharisees, and to a lesser extent the Sadducees. The Sadducees were basically Hellenists that wanted to integrate Judaism into the Hellenistic religion. So these were basically like Jewish neo-pagans. They wanted to like understand Zeus as Yahweh and try to integrate Greek philosophy into the Jewish religion. They were kind of weird, and somehow they got along with the Pharisees for some reason. In addition to these, there were, and again, Sadducees and Pharisees were, as you know, Judaism today. God is just God, a pure monotheistic religion. Now, there were other groups of believers that were like not proper Jews. Some of them come from the Samaritans to the north. They had like a primary Syrian background and had adopted religious traditions in there. Some of them became the Zealots. The Zealots were basically Al Qaeda in the time. They would murder Romans like you can't believe. At one point, the Zealots murdered something in the range of like 6 million Romans or something. It's kind of insane the amount of the revolts that they put off against the Romans are are shockingly efficient in their brutality and murder. It's actually really wild. And when you read about what the Zealots did, you kind of understand why the Romans just got fed up. You're not taught this because it makes them look bad, but the Jews were very violent in this time period, very murderous. And sorry, Susan. and in addition to these groups, there was one specific schism called the Essenes, and I've read a lot of the Essene literature. They're quite a fascinating group. The Essenes were around for since around probably 300 years before Jesus, and they were Trinitarians. They believed in a trinity of sorts. They believed that God was the Ancient of Days, the Lord of Spirits, and the Son of Man, which sounds an awful lot like Father, Son, and Spirit. As you know from the way Christians read the Old Testament, the Son of Man is understood as Jesus. The Essenes, they believe, not only did they believe in a Trinity, they believed in basically like local communityism. Like they didn't believe in urban living. They lived in rural areas. And the big thing is they rejected Jerusalem. They viewed Jerusalem as a lie. They viewed what we would understand as proper Judaism as nonsense. So in many ways, they rejected Judaism themselves. Now it's still up for debate if the Essenes became Christians or if the Christians just borrowed a lot of Essene talking points. It's not well known because, again, Rome came in and nuked the place, so there's not a lot of records left. What we do know is that, while the Essenes talked about a trinity, the Christians adopted a trinity God. And whereas the Essenes believed in a Ancient of Days, Lord of Spirits, Son of Man, the Christians believed in Father, Spirit, and Son. There's a lot of parallels. The Christians believed in a small structure, like kind of like a church structure, like the Essenes did. The Christians several Christians, even in the Bible, do quote from Essene literature. Jude famously quotes from Enoch, a text which was written by the Essenes. And Enoch itself, the text, ends up being a book within several Christian traditions. Most famously, Ethiopian Christianity adopts Enoch as part of its canon. So you have Essene texts written by Essenes, not written by like Jerusalem or Jews or anything. They're written in the desert sands by these like dissidents. It becomes canonical literature for some Christians. There's a lot of evidence that suggests Christianity is primarily from the Essene tradition, not the Pharisee tradition, and that Jesus himself, possibly quoting from Enoch also, I forget, I know Jude did, I forget if Jesus did, suggests that, Jesus himself comes from a very obvious Pharisee background. He's from the Judah. He's from like a background there, but he's also like, he's been to Egypt. He grew up in Egypt. He definitely passed by Essenes because the Essenes were out in the southern desert. So on the way to Egypt, they definitely interacted with the Essenes. And it seems as if Jesus kind of switched parties from Pharisee to Essene at some point. I don't want to say Jesus is an Essene because it's not clear, but what is clear is that early Christians definitely borrowed from Essene literature, and a significant amount of Essene worldview made its way into Christianity and its theology.
And so the last thing I want to address is you bring up this kind of like evocative distinction in what could be considered quote unquote Judaism. And this is something that you can actually see through the Bible. And it's the difference between, the rural prophet and the cosmopolitan priest class.
Yeah.
And how often in scripture there is this motif of essentially the prophet coming into the city and basically like dressing down the priest class.
Yes.
And you specifically talk about how Jesus is much more tied to the tradition of the prophets than that of the priests, at least in the context of, at then current Judaism, right? Because John the Baptist, right, was it was a son of the priest class, but he was essentially a mystic. He was a guy who lived out in the woods and ate grasshoppers. And yet that is the man who baptized Christ.
Yeah, and again, this is an important thing I need to make clear. I'm not saying that Jesus or John the Baptist started off as Essenes. John the Baptist's father was one of the high priests of Israel. He was definitely a Pharisee. Jesus' family, Mary was probably the daughter of a Pharisee and probably also a temple official. But at some point in time, they clearly broke ties with Jerusalem and went into the desert. There's this famous, honestly based quote by Jesus when he's talking to the Pharisees. And he basically says, you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify about yourselves that you are the descendant of murderers of the prophets. Go ahead then, complete what your ancestors started. It's kind of like Jesus saying, kill me, you fucks. But forgive my language. But like Jesus is going like he's basically Jesus is putting his lot in with the prophets, not the priests. Jesus is saying, I'm not associating myself with you degenerate priests in Jerusalem. I am with the prophets of the desert, and I'm not dealing with you people anymore. And he basically says, you're like Jesus basically uses a blood libel argument. Jesus being very naughty he's being very anti-Semitic. Let's say he's using blood libel and saying you have blood in your hands. You might as well add mine to it. So this is this kind of mirrors what Pontius Pilate says when he's talking about washing his hands of the blood of Jesus. Jesus is in many ways washing his hands of Jerusalem, basically cursing the Pharisees, like you've sealed your feet. You've sealed your future. You're going to be destroyed.
That's really fascinating, man. And
like
I said, we are 100% out of time. And in addition to addressing your notes on Nietzsche, which is the whole last, I'd say, third of this, really, like if you guys aren't interested enough, you should go read it, because there's stuff we had to miss. There's a whole section on the Greeks. There's a whole section on Plato that is all well worth your time. Like I read it, when it came out, and I reread it and was, drawn back into it. And in addition to this, you have another, particularly good Substack that we'll probably go through in the future if you want to, of course. But if you could tell everyone, where they could find you. Obviously, I've sent the links, but what do you do with Luthmplaer?
I'm attempting to be an architect in real life, but we'll see if that ever happens. But I like history. I really like history. I'm basically a theory cell at that stuff. But yeah, I just like looking up like forgotten narratives that have laid by the wayside of history. History that's been laid by the wayside of history, basically.
We've done a series on that. We did a series on Ice Age history, civilizations that was quite good, if you guys want to check that out. But in addition, I've linked your Twitter, where you can find your esoteric ramblings, and then also the Restoration Bureau, which is a project that you've run, which is essentially kind of propaganda for our guys. You've done a lot of art. You actually did my profile picture. You did your profile picture, and a lot of other kind of. I thought you did.
No, this profile picture comes from actual human hands. Some artists.
Well, never mind. You could have. This is what you just got to roll with it. You would have really impressed people with that.
No.
But anyway, man, thank you so much for coming out. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I think this is a good episode.
Yeah. Sorry for rambling a bit. Hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about Nietzsche more next time. And everybody should read ST's response. ST Structural Thoughts. I think that is his ad on Twitter. He's been a big inspiration for me, and I really enjoy his structured thoughts, because I don't have much structure to my thoughts.
Well, great. So obviously, as far as my stuff, you guys know where to find me. The show's available: Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Odyssey. Yep.
Finish your thought.
And then if you want to support the show, you can either do that by supporting our sponsor, Axios, which I do appreciate. JD, the guy who runs it, Heroic Well, has been, meeting with you guys, and apparently it's been going really well. Or you can support me more directly, which again, I do appreciate, because there are costs associated with the show. One last thing, obviously, George Bagby's fundraiser has been going on for a while. He got canceled, which really sucks. And in addition to the Give, Send, Go, which is pinned in chat and linked in the description, I will be holding a benefit stream for at least 8 hours on this Saturday, the 18th of March, 2023. Don't ask me about that after that day, where all of your favorite people will be sitting around, to raise more money for Bagby to get him out. And I will say, I know you probably don't want this public, Luthmplaer, but you were a very generous donor, and that's appreciated. But anyway, before we close this out, what do you want to say?
I want to end on a quote by my favorite pagan, just to give a little kudos to pagans. John Michael Greer, one of my favorite writers. He's a druid. He has a famous. Well, I'm going to paraphrase this quote. He wrote this really good article called "The The Sound of the Gravediggers, and he's basically criticizing Nietzsche's idea of God, of Übermensch rather, and his ending thoughts were something. I'm going to paraphrase. It's not an exact quote, but "Come to the grave Nietzsche dug for God. There you will find the gravediggers burying progress instead." It's one of my favorite quotes of his. I'll paraphrase this. He doesn't quite say it that way, but it's one of my favorite phrases.
Well, yeah, and obviously that's something that that we'll get into when we talk about Nietzsche, because it does flow very well. This article, there is a through line in it, and consider that kind of a teaser for next episode. But again, thank you so much, man, for coming. I enjoy speaking to you, and for you guys at home, remember, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.